All right, so I'll get started. Hi, I'm David Briggs, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land I'm speaking from, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. I'm here as Vice President and New South Wales Divisional Chair of the Colour Society of Australia, which is the Australian member body of the International Colour Association, or AIC. The Colour Society of Australia is a 100% volunteer-run non-profit organisation and welcomes all to its membership. This event continues a series of webinars organised and presented free of charge by the Colour Society of Australia New South Wales Division over the last 3.5 years, and it's the third in a series called Creating Colour, organised by committee members John Pretorius and Veronica Colvin. If you'd like to support us and to gain unlimited access to our recordings of our previous webinars and perhaps even become involved as a member, please consider joining us on the Colour Society website. We've had a great response of more than 80 registrants from all over Australia and 10 other countries. So we're asking everyone to remain muted during the talk. But if you have questions, please put them in the chat during the talk, and we'll try to get to them at the end. So Dr. Mark Liu is a fashion and textile designer, best known for pioneering zero-waste designs during his master's research at Central St Martin's College, London, while working at Alexander McQueen. His collections have been exhibited in museums around the world. His PhD research used 3D mathematics to invent the field of non-Euclidean fashion pattern making, which enables scientists and engineers to understand pattern making while working on advancements in the fields of 3D pattern making algorithms and 3D printing, which can be applied to space suits and medical garments. A former Chancellor's postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Technology, Sydney, he collaborated across disciplines to explore equitable gender laws in the fast fashion industry, synthetic biology, and algae-based carbon sequestering materials. His 2023 book, Sustainable Fashion Greenwash, exposes the misleading advertising of so-called sustainable fashion. So with that, I'd like to invite you, Mark, to share your screen and join us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be speaking with the Colour Society. And I'll just share my presentation screen. So I hope you can see that image.
That's great.
Great. All right. All right. I'm going to be talking about dyes, modern and ancient, and from the perspective of science and how we contextualize that, taking everything from the most traditional craft form to the most advanced synthetic biology that we're working on at the moment. From the dawn of human civilization, making things colorful has been really desirable. And in nature, there are vibrant colors all around us, from the shifting colors of things like the animals such as the chameleon, or the feathers of a peacock to show off its brilliant form to attract a mate. Color is essential to nature. In the ancient world, humans would take color, and usually they would find something colorful and crush it up and sort of grind it into something, and then they would smear it on themselves or on a substance. And that's what we talked about, things like paints and different applications in the different lectures, but I'm very much going to be addressing how to get color to stick to fabric, which is very tricky because paints, you don't really wash your canvas, or you don't sweat on your canvas. If we have fabrics, we have to launder them every couple of weeks, and this is a completely different process. And getting things to stick, getting them to be color fast is a real science and art form. Now, the image that I have shown for you is basically, this is a leaf, which is it was from a biohacking space in Brooklyn in New York. And the artist is basically, they've taken a leaf and they've taken a picture, and the light has gone through the leaf, and the parts of the leaf that are darkened have a lot of, the light has been blocked out. And if there's a light surface, the light goes through. And what happens is the leaf itself will photosynthesize, and sugar will appear at the parts with the different colors. And what they've done is they've let the leaf photosynthesize, and then they've taken the leaf once it's been trimmed, and they've actually put iodine on it so that you get a record of all the sugars, and you've transferred that image from a piece of paper through the leaf, through basically biology. It's coloring by sugar. So this is a representation of how nature can do amazing things, but also how humans have been adapting and playing with them to do all sorts of extremely fun things as well. And if we look at something like a butterfly, the Morphotex butterfly, it has extremely vibrant wings. And the reason why they're so vibrant is they've got these tiny little scales on the nanoscale, which is, it's 100 times sort of smaller than a human hair. So it's very tiny. And these little scales reflect the light in a really unique way and make them very iridescent. So in the past, we would say, oh, nature is amazing. This is a natural process. But at the same time, now that we have modern science, we can actually understand how this stuff works. And the reason why I want to show you these approaches, so blurring high-tech science and traditional techniques, is because sometimes there's a false duality between what is natural and what is considered science. And the strange reality is that in order to make things in our natural world, almost none of the things that we use are natural at all. The crops that we use are highly cultivated. They're genetically engineered. We have chosen specific species to do certain things. The dyes that we use a very particular kind of, if we're taking them from a natural source, we can't just use any plant. We naturally select the plants that work. Cotton, we had to use a specific kind of cotton. Otherwise, it just doesn't have the properties to be viable for production. And because of these things, basically, like, we turned a wolf into a cute Pomeranian dog. Everything that we do is highly genetically engineered, even though we don't like to think of it that way. And instead of having this false duality between nature and what is natural and good and what is science and bad and ambiguous, basically everything is all mixed up and everything is very ambiguous. Almost nothing is natural. And natural techniques can be extremely toxic and use heavy metals, and you can improve on them. That's the reason why we developed a lot of modern techniques. And then there are also very current techniques which need ethics, and they need thought, and they need the contribution of artists and designers and people who are traditional craftspeople to understand how they work. So I'd like to open up the whole, like to open up the floor for people and like to see things of how science and design and craft and art are all equally valuable, and how we need to cross-pollinate to get a better understanding of how color works. So if you think about textiles as an art form, this isn't actually an image from a site which is in Turkey at the moment, and it's a Neolithic textile dyeing site. And the reason that we know that is because textiles are so toxic. Even now, like thousands of years later, we have the remnants of the heavy metals and the dyes that they used. These are all natural dyes, and they're so toxic that archaeologists can pick them up and we know it's a textile site. And so the idea that natural dyes are automatically good and virtuous and have no downsides and leave no effect on the environment, that's not actually true. But in what's happened in recent years is we have improved on natural dyes. We have developed synthetic dyes, and now researchers like me work with scientists so that we can build something even better. We can learn from nature, or even control nature to build something which is even more environmentally friendly, optimal, something that is more sustainable for all of us. So some of the natural dyes I wanted to talk about, one of them, the typical ones would be something like Murex purple. And this is an image of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. So this is around 530 AD in this representation. And he's got this distinctive purple color. And this is Murex purple. And as I said in the past, one of the most typical ways of getting a dye on something is to find something of that color, mash it up, and stick it onto a textile. And these Murex mollusks So they're like a sea snail, and you can extract a little drop of dye from them. And these are the different colors that you can get. So this is a natural process, which is highly inefficient, but this is how they used to get dyes into the natural world. And this is why if you saw someone with purple, they would be super rich because this stuff is so hard to get. You would have to collect a whole bunch of these seashells, and you would have to go, and you can't just harvest them and milk them like a cow. You actually have to kill the mollusk, because the mollusk itself has a compound in it, which is called endoxin. And that's the purple that we love. We call it Tyrian purple or Murex purple, named after the kind of snail. And you have to go and basically stab it. And when it dies, it releases an enzyme which mixes with oxygen, and then you get endoxyl and you get the Murex purple dye that you actually need. So you only get one tiny little drop for every one of these little mollusks that you kill. So you would have to kill a lot of these sea fish just to dye something. And the process, you have to get these sea fish, so they're kind of briny, but then you have to kill them all, and it's incredibly smelly. And fun anecdote, this is the ancient world, but if you think about the dyeing processes, all the dyes that we would consider natural or traditional or authentic, I think Queen Elizabeth I herself basically had a mandate that no dyeing facility could be within 8 miles of any royal palace, royal facility, because it was just too smelly. So this is the reality of dyeing in the ancient world, or in medieval times. In traditional times, if you were doing traditional dyes, even in modern times, no one really wants to be right next to a textile factory, because it's just so polluting for the water and the land around it, which is why we kind of need to use science to do a better job of it, invent something else. So anyway, these little mollusks, they release this tiny little dye, and we collect it, and we can go, and with our dye, we can go and start to try and apply things to fabric. So getting the fabric to stick was quite challenging. We'll get back to sort of those kind of dyes, but we'll go through a few more of them. So another interesting one is cochineal. Cochineal is this tiny little bug, and it's red. And they would crush this bug up. Cochineal is also used in paints as well, but to get it to stick, that's also tricky. There is woad, which is this plant. Woad, you kind of need a binder to get things to stick together, but it's this plant, you mash it up, it's got a root, and you get this lovely blue color. Strange fun fact, if you look at the movie Braveheart, you may notice that Mel Gibson, his face is painted with this blue face paint. That's a depiction of woad. The thing that you don't really want to think about is to bind the woad to something, you need a binder. So we would typically use a protein-based binder. You would need eggs or some sort of casein from milk. But in the Highlands, you're not really going to get binder from anywhere, or that kind of protein that they could use before battle. So historically, they would use semen to use with the woad to get that binder to put on their face. So you don't really want to think about how they got that, but it's one of these weird trivia things about how woad has actually been built into culture. It's into fabrics, it's into cosmetics, it's into battle. It's a really intrinsic part of the ancient world, and it's one of these really cool essential colors. And then I wanted to cover some of these other ones that you may have seen. Saffron, you probably had saffron in some sort of, like in a food context. So that creates these really lovely saffron colored robes. Walnut shells, so really walnuts, grind them up, you can get some really great color. And then there's things like madder and oat gall. And in fact, you can pretty much take almost anything and you can find an application to dye with. And it's really fun. So onion skins, onions, like the world's most populous veggie, you can dye with those. You can take different plants and animals. Of course, within those different species, some dye better than others. And the key is basically to find what works. And there's a whole art and craft of finding the right ones, what binds them, how to treat them. Probably the specifics of those are too deep to dive into in such a short presentation, but it's a really fascinating area. And the wonderful thing about these natural dyes is you can find them, you can find the color that you want. The real challenge is to find a way of getting them to bind. And that's the difference, I think, a lot of the time between paint and textile dyeing when it comes to this craft that we do. Getting stuff to stick to fabrics is really hard. And it's the binders, the things that make them stick. So in things like pigments, you have a binder. With dyes, you have something called a mordant, or you can also have things like modifiers, things that change the pH. They make them either acidic or basic, which is the opposite of that. And a good example, or yeah, these are other kind of cool natural ways that you can dye things. The one that we're going to look at is indigo, which is indigo here. Yeah, so indigo, it's the one which is living blue, and that's a really fascinating process. So indigo is probably one that we're kind of, people are familiar with it because it's the blue in their blue genes. And you get you can get indican leaves, and you kind of dry them, you break down the cells, and you can put them in water. And if you break them down in water, you get indoxyl, which is a cool dye that we want, and it has a sugary compound. And you can sort of boil this up, and you get this insoluble part at the bottom. And you put some acids in there just to kind of, not acids, you get a basic compound. So that's the opposite of an acid. So an acid, it's on a technical level, an acid is a proton receiver or electron Lewis acids. How would I put that? So there's different categories of acids. Basically, if you have litmus paper and you put an acid on it, it turns red. If you put a base on it, it turns blue. I think if you go to Bronsted-Lowry, this is a bit of minutia, but it either accepts a proton or donates a proton. So a basic compound would be a proton acceptor, and you would call this in Lewis acids an electron paired donor. Anyway, so you've got acids, which makes things acidic, and basic things, which are the opposite. And they basically allow bonds to form. You take the basic compound and you put those with your indigo leaves, and you boil up, and it creates a precipitate, which is kind of indigo tin, which is this insoluble stuff that you can't really, you can use it in painting and it's really handy, but we can't use it in textiles because we need our indigo to be water soluble so it can enter the fibers of a fabric. So what you need to do is you need to lower the oxygen levels of the vat. And in sort of traditional techniques, these ideas were derived from trial and error. So they figured out that in order to, I don't think they knew that they needed to lower the oxygen because that concept was beyond them at the time, but they realized if you threw sugars and fermented things into the vat, it would actually help things stick. And this is because what's happening is bacteria is going in there, the fermented compounds are eating up all the sugar, and they're also taking out the oxygen out of the supply in the vat. And instead of things condensing back into the insoluble form of indigo, it turns into what they call indigo tin, which is white indigo. And that's the substance that is water soluble and that we can use. So in the beginning, they would just chuck things like fruits and fermented compounds. Later on, when we had a greater understanding in the 18th century, they would put compounds such as iron and rust to keep the oxygen levels down. So we take this substance and we can actually change the oxygen levels in the vat so that we can have a form of indigo that we can dye with. So then you immerse your indigo in your fabric into the indigo, and you get these beautiful colors. And this is like one of the cornerstones of dyeing. So it gets to the point where we have to describe what is a dye and what is a pigment, how are they different, what mechanism do they use. And this technical diagram that we have at the moment is it's a diagram of the structure of the molecule of a dye. And on one end, we have something which is called a chromophore, which is the compound that actually reflects light and creates color. because reflecting light is one mechanism in which color is created. And then the other part is the oxychrome. So that can be a single ring of benzene, which is that hexagonal structure. So that's a carbon structure, which is a single ring. You can also have two rings, which are bound together. That's a compound called naphthalene. And you have three rings called anthracene. And those are just different compounds, different kinds of dyes. But what's important to know is you basically, on one side, you have the bit that is colorful, and then you have the bit that sticks to the fabric. And fabrics can come in different compounds. So you can have synthetic fabrics, which are created from petroleum-based products. You can have cellulose-based fabrics. Cellulose is like cotton. You can have keratin-based fabrics, which are wool. And it's a protein-based structure, so they're all very different. Different techniques of getting things to stick. That's a bit of a craft, that's a science. But a lot of the times what you need is either what you call mordant, which is a heavy metal. You can have what they sometimes call modifier, which can be a mild acid or base, which can help things bond. And the reason why we need to change the pH is it basically allows some of these protein structures to unfold and attach themselves better. Other times they can form a nice covalent bond with the underlying material themselves. And this is the essence of dye chemistry, which can get kind of technical, and there are all sorts of perks and quirks to it. So in the past, you would say that all dyes would need to be pretty much water soluble, and all pigments would be water insoluble. But nowadays, we can do things like we can extract natural pigments, which are water soluble, and we can take dyes which are we can take dyes from sources which are water insoluble or water soluble and stick them in different ways. So it gets a bit modern science gets really hazy with these things, and we have different applications. One of the most important discoveries that came out sort of in the 18th century was the invention of things like morphine, which is artificial murex. So in the past, I showed you how difficult it was to take that Tyrian purple. We had to kill all those shellfish, and from that we got a single drop of dye. And that was an incredibly inefficient way of getting the dyes that we need. So in the 18th century, there's a man called Perkins, and he's known for Perkins purple, which is it's a form of murex purple. So he was basically trying to create quinine, which is stuff in tonics, in your gin and tonic. And he basically accidentally created a dye instead. And this is the age of chemistry. So instead of having to physically dig up stuff out of the ground and having to go and harvest a bunch of leaves, and within that batch, there may be variations that you can use and then you can't use. If you're able to synthesize things in a lab, the quality and the consistency and the ability to optimize the process becomes incredibly efficient. And murex purple is the alternative. So we saw you can kill a bunch of shellfish, or you can just synthesize the stuff. Now, this would open up a whole bunch of other problems because a lot of these compounds have to be mined or are from the petroleum industry. So the age of chemistry also has a whole bunch of different issues. And as soon as we entered this age of chemistry, where chemistry became the main component of learning how to do things, all sorts of dyes came out. And they're all really useful and interesting for different reasons. If you want to dye things for yourself, you may have noticed that if you went to your local supermarket or art store, they have things like RIT dyes or Dylon. And those are dyes that sort of generically dye a lot of things. And they tend to be a combination of what you would call reactive and acid dyes. So there are compounds. This is a tree of all the different kinds of dyes. There are more of them. A lot of these dyes, you really, unless you have a textile facility, you can't really dye with because the temperatures and the amount of heating and maintenance is not really practical for a home dyer. But the kinds of dyes that people use a lot of are things like direct dyes, which are really great for cellulose. They're very wash fast. There are acid dyes, which are good for dyeing protein fibers, such as wools or alpaca, all those kind of protein-based fibers. They're also direct dyes, which and fiber reactive dyes. Metal dyes, soluble vat dyes. The average dyer who's dyeing at home is not really going to encounter these. Some of these things like sulfur dyes, some of them they exist. We don't really use them as much as anymore, and in certain places they ban them because they're just not great for the environment, and they they're inefficient and they're messy. And the species of these dyes tends to be classified under azo, but there's also azo dyes which they tend to be not so great for the environment as well. So there's a lot of dye chemistry here, and to skip through a lot of it for this kind of time frame, these are the main ones that the average dye is going to use. So acid dyes, you're thinking about your wool, nylon, silk. Direct dyes, you'd use that for nylon rayon. So that's kind of like you would probably use those as a home dye if you're going to be coloring things. Reactive, they're very handy for a whole wide range of things. And the reason why I'm just covering these is that if you're looking to home dye something yourself, you would think, oh, what am I going to dye? What is the compound? What am I dyeing? So is it wool? Is it natural? Is it synthetic? And then you would break it down to, okay, say I'm dyeing wool, it's a protein-based one. Okay, there are several dyes I could use. I could use a reactive dye, I could use an acid dye. So this is my strategy. I also wanted to show you that there are many other kinds of dyes. So that dyeing, you could do it, but it's quite intensive, and when we're teaching these kind of things, we don't usually get students to do that much of that kind of stuff because it's just too intense. But I just want to show you there's a wide range of dyes. The craft of knowing which one to use can be quite beautiful to experience. And there's also a lot of chemistry going on in the background to make things easy for everyone, but it's just good to get a sense of how things work. One of the other kind of dyes, so dyeing things which are natural, fibers, that tends to be quite easy to do. Dyeing things which are synthetic can be quite difficult because some of those temperatures that we would need to dye at, so you can boil away if you're dyeing, if you get up to like 200 degrees when you're dyeing, that's okay. You can do that on a stove or you can do that outside. When you start dyeing things like polyester, the temperatures that we need and the pressure and the temperatures just go through the roof. So sometimes it's like we're talking about 300, 400 degrees if you're trying to be efficient about things. So the average person who wants to make something which is polyester or have something which is synthetic dyed, there are things called dispersed dyes, and they're actually really fun. So dispersed dyes have this really interesting property where you can draw on a substrate, a surface. So you can get a piece of paper and you can paint on that surface with the dispersed dye. And then there are even things like, I think like Crayola has crayons that you can have dispersed dye on, and you can draw on them and you can press them. Or you can even get a printer and take an image and print on it using this sublimation ink. You print on this sublimation paper, and once you've got this image, you can heat press, transfer it onto a piece of synthetic material, such as a polyester or nylon. And the great thing about this process is it doesn't use very much water. So the dye itself, it exists as a solid form. And then there's a property. So you've got solid, gases, and liquids. And then there's a form when you jump from a solid form, there's no liquid form into a gas form, and that's called sublimation. And what you do is like when you paint down the dye and you heat press it, it sublimes. So it heats, turning from a solid to a gas, and then back into a solid again, into the material itself. And this is a really handy process that we use to dye things. So a lot of, if you've got a corporate t-shirt or you've tried to make a custom t-shirt for a friend, dye sublimation is a process that they use a lot of the time. And it's not just for those kind of applications. You can take your Crayola heat set crayons and you can heat set something on, or you can actually take the dispersed dyes themselves, water them down with water and paint with brush strokes and create all sorts of artful effects and heat press them. The thing that you have to remember when you're using these processes is that they mirror. So you have to mirror the effects if you've got artwork that has text or something like that. There are a whole bunch of other dyes as well, such as naphtha dyes and azo dyes that I talked about that we don't really use as much time anymore because they're just kind of toxic and not great for the environment. And they're more optimal ways of doing things which use less water. So the other thing that we use a lot of, which is like the counterpart to dyes, is pigments. And we're probably very familiar with them. Pigments used for paint, but pigments also tend to be the things that we use in t-shirts. So if you've got a t-shirt, it's probably printed with a pigment. And pigments are actually they tend to be minerals that are ground up very fine. So you take a metal such as copper and you grind up really fine and it makes a blue color. Iron can make a green color. You take all these different colors and they make different components. So this is how they traditionally worked. You can also find minerals like clays, oxides. So everyone's favorite crayon colors like burnt sienna, umber, ochre, they can all be ground up to make pigments. You can even take things like vine black and indigo and grind them up and turn them into a pigment. And the key to pigments is pigments don't really stay there by themselves. You need a binder. And there are traditional binders that you would use in nature. You can use like a resin, or you could use like gum arabic. You can get a soy milk kind of protein-based binder. But the reality of most of these binders is they all use acrylic copolymer. So they take a compound which comes from acrylic acid, and that's made into this sort of plasticky compound. And even all the most environmentally friendly dyes that pigments that we use still tend to 40% acrylic copolymer, because that's just the mechanism to get them to stick. In recent years, pigments have advanced, and we start grinding them up to a really fine texture. So before I talked about things on the nanoscale, so that's a very small scale. Human hair is like the microscale, so we would grind everything down to the microscale. Now we can grind everything down to the nanoscale, and that's really great because the pigments that we get have a much better texture. So when you touch the surface, they feel soft instead of like a raised plasticky surface. And because of these new sort of nanoscale pigments, we can get much finer quality in our pigments when we put them down. And there are also different techniques for getting them down. So there's different forms of acrylic copolymer binders. So there's like polyurethane acrylate, or there's polyethylene glycol hexylsulfate, coproxylate, which is this is kind of technical stuff, but basically we need a binder to stick things down. And one of the things I'm really keen on researching at the moment is, can we get different mechanisms to get things to bind which are not acrylic based? So can we either make that acrylic from a non-petroleum based source, or there are other mechanisms that can get things to bind. A lot of these are used in things like cosmetics, and they tend to be a lot weaker in their chemical bonds, but they could definitely be worth exploring in the future for textiles applications. So pigments, they're really handy, and they form kind of like a progression. So we've got our binders, we've got our dyes, and they've all they're this journey. So we went from ancient civilizations, dyeing things with the things that we found, crushing up beetles, and then we finally synthesize plants. We get mauve from our murex purple, and then suddenly we're getting synthetic chemistry. We're getting hundreds of compounds. We're getting millions of tons of dye produced annually, and the efficiency and the ability to customize things has gone through the roof. And now dyeing is the domain of, like, the fundamental chemistry of things is a multi-million-dollar industry, which you really need like really high-end chemists to navigate. And this is why it's become so complex. And traditional dyes, they can do some really interesting things, but like, we should never forget where we came from. But at the same time, the complexity of chemistry and the amount of understanding that you need to understand how things work becomes pretty technical, and is something that we have to adapt to. And this brings me to another form of ways of coloring things. So the fundamental ways of coloring things that we've looked at the moment are pigments, which are things that stick into a textile. We've also got dyes. They dig in deeper, so they don't need to stick on the surface. But then structure, like we talked about peacock feathers, we talked about butterflies. Structure itself, the shape of an object in space, can actually determine the color of a thing. So the butterfly, it had an iridescent color because it reflected light in a particular way. If you remember back in the 80s, if you're around back then, or you had access to a hypercolor t-shirt, hypercolor t-shirt is thermochromic ink, where the ink basically changes color if it is heated. So that is a pigment which has a crystalline structure on the end. And what happens is when heat is applied, the shape of the crystal changes. And as the crystal changes shape, that's when the reflectiveness of it changes. So its shape determines what light it reflects, and that changes the frequency. And thus you have a t-shirt. So when it is heated, it has a different color. Now, there are also many different forms of this process. There are photochromic inks, which change with UV light. There are hydrochromic inks that they change with water. A whole bunch of different processes that have this mechanism. But I started with the humble hypercolor t-shirt to show that as we look at new technology, dye itself and pigment itself becomes really much, it becomes a 3D shape, and they can be used in different ways. So this is, now I'm getting to the really interesting, crazy stuff that is kind of super modern. This is a dress that has been created by a group which are growing transgenic silk. So basically, they've taken silk, which is a cocoon, and they've injected it with a compound. So they've changed the DNA of the silkworm, and they've put DNA from a coral that glows in the dark into that silkworm. So its DNA has changed, and it's created this transgenic silk, which, if you view it under certain lighting conditions, has this glowing effect. So you can actually change the DNA of a structure, which would change the structure of the underlying structure that's created in nature itself to create a color. Someone asked on the Facebook group if the cocoons that were injected with this DNA, if the silkworms were boiled in the process. And I looked it up just before the lecture, and I have to say, I don't really know. I would have to look that up, or I would have to contact the people who did this process. But usually when you are going to create a fabric like that, you would have to get past ethics approval to get your experiment signed off on. At the same time, synthetic biology is such a young art form. Synthetic biology is the ability to create artificial life. So the same way that you can code a computer with zeros and ones, you can now code DNA or RNA, like life itself, on a computer. And if you want to look at Google Blast, basically you can put your genome into Google, and as a series of, they have the base pairs. So there are 4 base pairs that make up life. So you can put this genetic code in, and we can look it up like in a computer. Synthetic biologists, we now code computer code the same, like we code genetic code in a similar manner that we would a computer code. There are programs, there are rules. We now understand how this stuff works. So you can basically make artificial life. And I'm not sure if many people are familiar with that, how easy that process is. It used to be very difficult, but now I used to run a program where we would take, I think, like second-year design students. We would take an algae, form of algae, P. tricornutum. We would go on a computer program. We would take the DNA from a jellyfish, splice that in, shoot that DNA into the algae, and suddenly you have glowing algae. And it used to be extremely expensive. Now to get those kind of synthesizing mechanisms to get that artificial DNA made, it's maybe couple $100 to $1,000 for a sample, compared to when it used to be impossible, or millions of dollars to do things. That's when people are still struggling to deal with the human genome. But the ability to mess with DNA has been incredibly influential. That's part of the reason why everyone got a COVID vaccine so quickly, because of these new technologies. We are moving at light speed. And this new technology is fascinating, but it's also highly unregulated, and it's a bit of a wild west. But the technology is moving so fast. Saying that, the ability to actually change nature and genetics itself to change color is truly remarkable. this is the process that I showed before from this biohacking space, GenSpace, which is lovely biohacking space in Brooklyn. And this is the process of that leaf with the photosynthesis, where they've actually gone in and, so they've created a mask. The light, in this case, the sugar has collected in certain places, and then they've used iodine to set the sugars. And that's what you would call biodesign. It's this biological design. So it's this merging of traditional craft and science. So some of the reasons why we look at this stuff is for the future is the dye industry is incredibly intensive, and there are people who have been coloring stuff for millennia, and they've been doing it without water, and they've been far less intensive, and that's bacteria. So these are examples of bacteria that actually create colors in different colonies, and they're really remarkable. So rhodolurula, handfuls, that creates an orange colony. And there's also asparaginus. Oh gosh, it's a mouthful. So if you look at these compounds, these are bacteria that have been colonized on petri dishes, and they can actually grow specific colors. And they will grow the colors and make the dyes without having to kill a shellfish, without having to extract fossil fuels out of the ground, do a bunch of chemistry. They just do them inside the cells. And this is the kind of technology that modern researchers are trying to unlock. This is a cute image just of that process of the previous image of the process of using UV light, and just for the leaf, the compound C6H12O6, that's glucose. So it's just like a fun geeky joke about where the dye is coming from. So Natsai Audrey Chiesa, she's a wonderful designer. So she works in the space where she's using, I think she's the CEO of a chemical company now that is using bacterial dyes to dye things. So we're talking about there's no need for the heavy metal mordants that we put with our pigments and dyes. There's no need for modifiers. She's just taking the bacteria, smearing the bacteria all over the fabric and culturing it in different ways so it will grow the colors. And this is remarkable. This is very interesting in terms for an ecological and a scientific perspective, because you're basically getting color without any of the footprints, the carbon footprints or the chemical footprint of other things. The difficulty is that we can't really control it at the moment. Well, not at this kind of designer level. You're just swishing things around. Bacteria is going to do what bacteria is going to do, and the colors are not very controllable. So a lot of the research goes into how do we take these dyes and make them more usable for different applications. One of the things that I like to work with is I work with algae. So algae, people think of algae as blue-green algae, which is actually cyanobacteria. That's a whole different species. But algae can be everything from like kelp and seaweed, like really big macroalgae, to these tiny little microscopic organisms, which is microalgae. And there's more algae than species of any plant, animal, fungus on the tree of life. And there's so many different kinds of algae, and each one of them does a different thing. So some of them, they just become really fat and they fill themselves with protein. And we tend to use these, instead of growing an animal to eat, maybe we just grow the protein of an algae and we harvest that out. Or something like omega, the omega that you would get, the fish supplements that people take, omega-5, or is it omega-4? That stuff actually comes from algae, and then fish eat it. And then we kill the fish, and then we take the substance out of the fish. Why can't we just take the algae directly? So this is the kind of stuff that we work on at the moment. So I work at a place called the Climate Change Cluster at the University of Technology, Sydney, and it's a bunch of climate scientists who are working on using algae to decarbonize the atmosphere. And one of the things that I get to work on is looking at algal dyes. So there are many different kinds of microalgae that create pigments within the cells. So we can get blue algae. So there's a compound called phycocyanin. If anyone remembers those sweet Smarties, I think in the 80s there was a new campaign where like Smarties now came in a new color, and that was blue. And that was a really big deal at the time because blue candy was amazing. But that actually comes from phycocyanin, which is an extracted form of algae. And getting phycocyanin to dye into fabrics is actually quite challenging, but if we can get a blue material that used to come from something like copper, coming from a form of algae, that's really cool. There's also carotenoids that makes that carrot color. There's also sort of red colors that you can get from red algae. And there's also pink algae that you can get from a compound called xanthine. And that's the same kind of color compound that they have in sushi. I think Young Henry's, the brewing company in Newtown, did a edition of beers that were pink beers, which also used that xanthine color. So the future of a lot of these dyes and processes heads towards either taking a compound out of nature to create an alternative to a dye or pigment. So we want to get dye and pigment from a different source, which is less carbon intensive, or to physically change the substance's shape and texture on the outside so that we get a color. And these are some really exciting parts of the industry that we are looking at. The other part that we don't really talk about as much is water itself. So water, if you use water in the dyeing process, it's incredibly, like, we just ruin the water supply. Even if you purify things, it's not great. There's certain places in China where you can basically determine what the color trends are by the amount of color residue on the side of a lake, because that's what the color dyes have been doing. So I'm sure when the Barbie movie came out and everyone was making everything pink, the dyes, the river would flood with pink foam. And that's really terrible. So there are now things like waterless dyeing, which are very exciting. So before I talked about subliming things, sublimation printing, where a substance changes from a solid into a gas with no transition in between. One of these compounds is carbon dioxide. So if you have carbon dioxide, it can be in the air, or it can be sort of fizzy bubbles in a drink. And then there's like dry ice. And there's no in between. There's no real kind of liquid carbon in nature. But what you can do is you can pressurize the carbon down at many atmospheres, and it creates this liquid called supercritical carbon dioxide. And what's really great about it is it has a very acidic property. So you get all the properties of an acid without actually having to pour a solvent or an acid or a base in, which is a chemical additive. So just the state of the carbon itself creates the conditions for dyeing. So what we can do is we just take carbon dioxide out of the air, pressurize it, pump that in, and use that to dye things. And then we have waterless dyeing, which is amazing because imagine if you're dyeing, you have all the colored residue, and then you have to, even if you evaporated all the water, you still end up with this residue of chemicals at the bottom. It takes a lot of energy to separate the water from the waste. It's a lot to deal with. But with waterless dyeing, what happens is as soon as you let go of the carbon dioxide, it just turns back into a gas again, and that you reclaim. And all the waste and all the leftover dyes is just left as a powder. So you just take those compounds out, and you're left with your dye. This process is quite new and expensive, which is why we don't use it everywhere, but it's a really exciting way to look at processes. And I'm conscious of the time. I've put a bunch of sites up which are handy if you're looking at dyes. One of the ones that I really like is the one at the bottom, which is Paula Birch. She's basically a dye chemist who also dyes things. So she's a craftsperson. She's an artisanal dyer, but she also knows the underlying science. So she has a really wonderful perspective. She can take the stuff that is in the language of craft and designers and artists and translate it into the pure chemistry which scientists use. So I really love that site. Going from the bottom up, there's also natural dyeing resources. So I've probably been saying lots of bad things about how inefficient natural dyeing is, but natural dyeing and the whole field of dyeing things using natural processes, it's just really fun. It is culture. It is a craft. It is art form. It is worth retaining. It is valuable because we understand where we came from, and understanding all these different processes is really cool. I still use this process because I find all the natural techniques and then I compare them to the scientific research, and often the two don't actually align. And that's when we actually learn something new. We can learn how to make a natural process more optimal, or how to be more efficient, or how to get better dyes and colors. Pigments. pigments, I've just left the site for Permanent Aquid, which is like a pigment company. They do water-based dyes, craft color, and diamond. They just tend to be the kinds of places that you would buy your supplies from. And you would say, oh, I want to dye with, I want to dye wool, so this is the dye I would choose, or I want to dye silk, so this is what I choose. So they're just kind of really handy resources. So I just left a little bit of time at the end just to talk about a few of the interesting developments. So I talked about dyes from bacteria, I talked about dyes from different forms, and I talked about genetically engineering things. So some of the things that we can do now is you can literally specifically grow breeds of cotton for a particular color. So we could get, say, a pink cotton because that's the species it was. But I'm aware that I'm probably out of time if we want to have questions. So I'll leave it there and I'll just see if you have any questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mark. That's fantastic. So I have to head out now, but I'm going to hand over the question session to Dr. John Pretorius, who's one of the co-organizers of this series. So, and John, I'll make you host now.
Hi, can you hear me, David?
Yep, I can now. Yep.
Okay, fantastic. Oh, well, Mark, thanks very much. That was absolutely fantastic. I think I'll go straight to the one question that came up and got a couple of likes on the chat. Talking about the making dyes using algae. And, you know, as we're all very aware, everything is finite. That presumably includes algae. And so I think that's what was driving this question is, in what sense might there be a limit on that, and might it itself become a bad idea at some point?
So with the algae at the moment, we actually farm it. So this is a new thing that we've invented out of, well, it's been done in small scale, but we now have algal farms. So algal farms can be these bioreactors that they can be just large bags of water that we grow the algae in. They can be these tubes that you put on the roof thing. A lot of modern architects now, to look sci-fi, they put bags of algae that are shaped, that just need sunlight. So we don't really use native algae. But we do something called bioprospecting. So we can find like one algae in nature and we take that back. And then we just grow that. We create the optimal conditions. We give it all the food that it needs and we let it just multiply and multiply and multiply until it grows. And it grows really quickly. So some algae doubles in biomass every 24 hours. The scale, it's like, if you want to grow a human, you need to have the baby needs to sit in the womb for 9 months and gestate and do all sorts of things. But if you haven't cleaned your bathroom, the E. coli in your toilet will replicate so fast. E. coli and bacteria, they replicate so fast. It's a completely different scale to human biology. So short answer, we are now growing things in algal facilities. And one of the wonderful things about that is they can be anywhere. So the Young Henry's Brewery in Newtown actually has an algal bioreactor that they feed the excess carbon dioxide to. And that feeds algae that they can now use to put into the byproduct of their fermentation process. And that actually makes it really attractive to cows. And then when they eat that, the cows actually, they don't belch as much. So the methane that comes out of the cows is actually reduced by about 50%, which is also really good. So there's all sorts of wonderful applications for that. But algal blooms, like algae is so populous, like it creates half of the oxygen in the entire atmosphere. We're probably not going to run out of it anytime soon.
Thanks for that. I think one of the things that struck me was just how difficult it is to evaluate the environmental impact of any one dye or dye process. You know, you referred to the water issue, maybe with traditional dyeing, and then you're talking about a more modern process, which used I think the supercritical carbon dioxide. And I thought to myself, well, I don't know how much energy it takes to create that supercritical CO2. So can you give us a framework of how to think about the overall, the actual footprint of a dye or a dye process?
So if you took something like the indigo dyeing, you can dye it up in a vat, but the process is highly inefficient. You know, in order to get that tiny amount of dye, you know, it's cool to do if you're doing artisanal batches, but if we were all going to dye our indigo jeans that way, like the amount of leaves you would need, the amount of things like it's kind of impractical, it would be better to use a chemically based dye. Chemical based dyes, there are ways of treating the water treatment plants on the way out so that you get reduced impacts on the environment. But the lack of legislation and oversight means that people just don't use them. There's nothing legally binding people to do these things. People will very irresponsibly just do these things. But even some of the best processes do create very terrible compounds. Supercritical carbon dioxide is very expensive at the moment because it's just such a new technology. So in the past, it was about $4 million just to get a facility, which means, you know, you can't really have one unless you're like in the research group in the Netherlands or in the States or parts of Germany where they're doing this kind of high-tech research. But the cost of it has gone down by about, like, some of the new units, like 2 million from 4 million, which is massive. And so companies like Adidas have been trying to play with this kind of stuff. We use it in algae as well. So we use supercritical carbon dioxide to mass manufacture algae. So the cool thing about these things is if you move them at scale, suddenly we don't have to have a solvent. We don't need to do water wastage. So we can put it in a supply where there's no water. Doesn't need to be near a stream. It's a relatively new technology. So I don't know if this is going to be a mass adopted, to be honest, because it's early days. But the potential of it seems very great. But its efficiency in terms of like creating less waste is good, but optimizing that process, throw some engineers, get a bunch of PhD engineers to kind of work on that for many years, or get the industry to accept it, and the price will go down over time. Still early days though.
Oh, thanks for that. I just want to go to a couple of questions about dyeing with natural pigments. So I see Raylene Clark was asking about issues with a mildew that sometimes grows when you do natural dyeing. So how do you prevent that if you're the natural dyer and you don't want mildew on your clothes after dyeing?
Bacteria basically makes fools of us all. Like we try to control bacteria and fungi and things like that, and we are out of control. So you'll probably encounter this phenomenon where you'll be printing with, say, a pigment or something like that, and you have the binder. So you make up your binder. Some of those binders also have like alginates in them, and that is just like food for mildew or mold or different things. Unfortunately, I would get rid of that stuff as quickly as possible, because as soon as it's contaminated, it will contaminate everything. So I've had students who have got moldy pigment buckets, and they've tried to print with it, and then they've gone and they've got like infected eyes and things like that. So for your own personal safety, I would isolate anything that's covered with mildew and bacteria. If you keep your conditions really clean, in theory, you can keep things slightly more bacteria-proof, but bacteria can be airborne. It can be microbes can go anywhere. If you think about your toilet, there's like streptococcus, E. coli, just like growing all the time. And like the waste products that come out of your human body, they're not that dirty, but they're such food for bacteria. Like it just accumulates everything. So you imagine that we've taken these natural dyes, which are like indigo. It's like sugar and indoxal or indigo tin. It's just like food. So try and keep your spaces clean. Try and be quite methodical and contain everything. That's the best I could suggest.
Oh, yeah. Well, thanks. That sounds sensible. There's a question here from Marsha Cohen about working with fungi and mushrooms in dyeing, and just asking whether you've got any experience or anything to rely on that front, because it seems to have become popular recently.
I think that's a really interesting area. So I sort of look at things from a chemical perspective. Like I'll take it, I look at it, I'm like, okay, where's it come from? Oh, is it protein-based dye? You know, how does it function? It's a kind of a really interesting area because you can take things like rust, you can take tea, like anything dyes anything. Getting things to stick into fungi, I think, would be the challenge. Finding the right combination of modifiers and mordants to keep everything going. But fungi is also this really cool intersection between bacteria. So some of the some of the bacteria that we think of as bacteria, like the spectrum of like this kind of spectrum, it's hazy. They tend to be on the fungal end of the spectrum. So you can actually get some really cool colors. So I think it was like those 2 bacterial colonies that I was showing. They're actually a variant of fungi, a fungal colony. So they're technically fungus and they're also bacteria. So I'm guessing she's talking about sort of grinding up fungus powders and things like that, which is slightly different. But yeah, I haven't really done that much with the fungi itself, but I have worked with it from a bacterial perspective.
Okay, thank you. Now, I think I guess we should probably wind up soon, but there's another question here which sort of intersects with one that I was thinking about as well, from Alicia Green, about the currently most ethical and or sustainable processes used in commercial industry. And it sort of dovetails with a different question I had, which was, we talked in the context of paints about what's disclosed in retail setting, what is disclosed about the properties of the paint, and what the end user can actually know. So it sounds to me like there's no standards for disclosure, really, that there's no simple way for an average user of dyes, which is everyone, to figure out whether somebody is sticking to a particularly good process. So maybe it's a part A and part B. Is there a best process right now? You say that process by that company is wonderful. And part B is, can we find out anything at all in general when we're buying these things?
So this is actually a really interesting question. So some of the best pigment companies that we use, about 10 years ago, we all switched to a certain kind of water-based pigment. And it's like, it's water-based. It's wonderful. Water is in the title. That's great. And it had a great handle and feel. So we used that. And that's probably the best thing that we have at the moment. But you get all the details on the back of the container and it sounds great. But then if you buy a big batch of it, you need technically you can get the information, you have to technically declare if something is a hazard. If it's, is it toxic? And you have to legally disclose what it's made out of. And then this is the interesting part where you're like, oh, this pigment has a binder which is technically 45% acrylic copolymer. And it's like, it's water-based and it's vegan, but it's also 45% plastic. Like, it's really difficult for the average consumer to deal with that kind of stuff. At the same time, it's probably the best stuff out on the market until we invent something better. So like I work with things like taking phycocyanin and getting to dyeing things with phycocyanin, the blue algae pigments. And that has issues because when the temperature goes above 45 degrees, the color just disappears, because in nature, if you boiled an algae beyond 45 degrees, that cell is going to, the protein is going to denature. You'll lose that color. So yeah, I'm a lot of the time giving the best, like giving people like this brand and that brand, it's not really helpful. The easy answer to a really complex question is that at the moment, everything that we use is slightly terrible, which is the reality of it. Everything has an impact, which is not going to give us a sustainable future. And that's where we have to invent new stuff. And that's why I do the research that I do. If we could just have a beautiful future just by using traditional stuff or the things that we have at the moment, I wouldn't need to do, like, I would paint and I would draw and I would make beautiful things instead. But we need better stuff, and that's just what we need.
I think that's a really great note to end on. We really have to thank you for giving us a sort of a glimpse. I mean, it's a bit of a tired thing to say, but it literally was a window for me into a totally different world. You sort of suspect it exists, and now we know for sure. And it was a great presentation, gave us insights in lots of different directions. So I'm sure all of us have an hour's worth of question, but not this time. So look, thank you so much, Mark. That was wonderful. And I just want to say to everyone that this series will continue. So we've got a couple more coming up, and we're going to move out of the very physical world next towards, first of all, creating digital color, possibly digital painting, and then looping back to digital printing, where you're rendering your digital color back into physical form. But anyway, for today, thank you, Mark, and thank you everyone for attending, and see you at the next one.